Spring 1945. As the Third Reich crumbled, a story began to circulate among Allied officers, a story about General George S. Patton. He was interrogating a captured German general, pressing him on the catastrophic, pointless losses his command had suffered in the final weeks. The German officer reportedly offered no excuses, no remorse. He just laughed. It was a cold, detached laugh, as if the thousands of dead were a mere statistic, an abstraction. This chilling display of professional indifference in the face of Patton's fury would become a legend. But did it actually happen? The story is powerful, but it has one major problem. Official records show no General Heinrich Kessler in this context. No diary entry, no after-action report confirms the incident. This forces a deeper question. If the legend is a fabrication, what was the reality? What did the real, documented encounters with captured German generals reveal about the men who orchestrated the war? By the spring of 1945, the collapse of the German front was absolute. For Allied intelligence, this produced an unprecedented opportunity, a flood of captured Wehrmacht generals. They were moved to two primary collection points. The first was a hastily converted luxury hotel in Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg, codenamed Ashcan. The second, for the highest value captives, was Trent Park, a stately home in North London. These men were the product of a century of Prussian military tradition. They saw war as a technical profession, a science of destruction governed by principles of obedience, staff work, and operational art. For many, the battlefield was an abstraction, a map with symbols, not a field of men. Their duty was to the state and the operational plan, not to the individual soldier whose life was expended to achieve it. On the other side stood a commander like George S. Patton, whose philosophy was almost feudal. Writing in his diary, he viewed leadership as a deeply personal pact. A commander, he wrote, is a man who has the ability to make other men do what they don't want to do and like it. For Patton, a general was personally accountable for the blood of his men. Their deaths were his responsibility, a debt on his soul. Two worlds were about to collide in the interrogation room. One, a culture of detached technical mastery. The other, a belief in the crushing moral weight of command. With Germany's most senior officers now in captivity, the Allies began the process of understanding the minds that ran the war, and their first findings were not what they expected. The first formal interrogations began, and the results were baffling. The transcripts are a study in professional detachment. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the architect of the 1940 victory in France, discussed the annihilation of entire armies on the Eastern Front with the calm, analytical language of an engineer examining a failed blueprint. There was no defiant laughter, no visible remorse, just a meticulous dissection of tactical errors and logistical shortfalls. This wasn't a denial of responsibility, it was a redefinition of it, purely in operational terms. The human cost was simply not part of the equation. This professional coolness, however, was just the surface. To find the truth, Allied intelligence needed to hear what the generals said when they thought no one was listening at all. And so, Allied intelligence went hunting for the truth, not in the interrogation room, but in the spaces in between. The hunt led them to Trent Park. To the generals, it was a gilded cage, a country estate with fine meals and well-kept gardens, a place to relax and talk amongst themselves. But it was a lie. The entire facility was a carefully constructed listening device. Microphones were hidden in the light fixtures, behind the skirting boards, inside the billiard table. In the basement, a team of secret listeners, many of them German Jewish refugees who had escaped the Reich, sat with headphones on, transcribing every unguarded word, 24 hours a day. Their mission was to capture what the generals truly believed, away from the watchful eyes of their captors. The first thing the listeners heard was a chorus of blame. The transcripts, thousands of pages long, reveal an obsession, but the target was never their own failure. It was always Hitler. General after general, from the famous tank commander Heinz Guderian to the stoic Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, privately raged against the Bohemian corporal's interference. Hitler was an amateur, a madman who had ruined their brilliant plans. They blamed the Russian winter. They blamed the Italians. They blamed a lack of oil. It was a consistent, self-serving narrative. They were professionals betrayed by a dilettante. But as the analysts at the British intelligence unit MI-19 reviewed the transcripts, they saw something deeper and more disturbing than simple blame shifting. Even in what they believed was total privacy, the generals almost never expressed remorse for the men they had led. There was no discussion of personal guilt, no anguish over the pointless slaughter. General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, who had commanded armies in Italy, was recorded discussing the destruction of his forces. His tone was not of a man mourning his soldiers, but of a craftsman lamenting the loss of valuable tools. The analysts gave this phenomenon a name: a crisis of responsibility. This was the very thing that so enraged George Patton. While the legend of his confrontation with a laughing general remains unproven, his private diary from 1945 is filled with the same fury. After meeting with captured German officers, he wrote with contempt about their arrogance and their complete lack of personal honor. He saw them as a class of men who viewed war as a chess game, and their soldiers as nothing more than expendable pieces. He wrote, "It is a popular idea that a soldier must not think. I say that he should think. I do not want a man who is a kowtower." To Patton, the German generals were the ultimate kowtowers to a flawed tradition and a criminal state, and had abdicated the most sacred duty of a commander. This detachment was not just a product of the war's final desperate days, it was systemic. Look at the post-war analysis of Stalingrad by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, widely considered one of Germany's most brilliant strategists. In his celebrated memoir, Lost Victories, he provides a masterful, ice-cold dissection of the strategic blunders that led to the destruction of the Sixth Army. He critiques Hitler's refusal to allow a breakout, the failure of the Luftwaffe's air supply, the tactical details of his own failed relief attempt. But the nearly 300,000 men who were sacrificed, starved, frozen, and annihilated are treated as a data point, a factor in a complex operational equation. The human cost is an afterthought to the strategic problem. The evidence, from the secret recordings at Trent Park to the public writings of Germany's most respected commander, paints a consistent picture. A military culture where professional duty had become a shield against moral accountability. But was this professional distance a uniquely German phenomenon? Or was the line between a necessary military mindset and a moral failing blurrier than the Allies wanted to admit? The uncomfortable truth is, this kind of cold calculation was not a uniquely German trait. Allied planners, preparing for the D-Day landings, worked with statistical projections of acceptable casualty rates. They knew with grim certainty that thousands of men would die on the beaches of Normandy before the day was over, a necessary price calculated in advance. The same brutal calculus was applied from the air by the architects of the strategic bombing campaigns over cities like Dresden. In any modern army, a degree of professional distance is essential for high command to function. So if both sides relied on this detached statistical approach to war, what was the real difference? What separated the Allied calculation of a necessary price from what interrogators saw as a total German moral collapse? The difference lay in the final accounting, in what was said after the price was paid. In a secret Trent Park recording, a general analyzes the destruction of an entire army on the Eastern Front. His tone is that of an engineer. He speaks of insufficient winter equipment, overextended supply lines, and a miscalculation of enemy reserves. The annihilation of 250,000 men is treated as a flaw in the operational architecture. There is not one word of grief. Then there is Patton. On May 10, 1945, after meeting a captured German field marshal, he exploded in his diary. "This is the most perfect example," he seethed, "of the fact that the German has no sense of honor. He has no more sense of responsibility for his men than a dog." Here, the two worlds collide, not in battle, but in belief. One worldview sees a technical problem, the other, an unforgivable moral failure. And so we return to the story of the Laughing General. It was never a documented event, it was an explanation, a piece of military folklore, born from the profound and unsettling chasm that Allied commanders witnessed. The legend gave a human face to a systemic failure, a command culture that believed professionalism was a substitute for humanity, and that following an order absolved a man of the price of that order. The Laughing General wasn't a real person. He was the personification of a question that defined the war's moral conflict. The war was won with bullets and steel, but it was ultimately defined by a single, inescapable question. What does a commander owe the men he leads into the fire?